Together, we work as one for better LGBTIQ lives. Outright.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to Out Summit. Out Summit brings together members of our diverse movements from across the globe. It is where human rights activists, community leaders, government officials, corporate funders, and allies come together to call for equality, justice, and solidarity. This is an opportunity for us to celebrate our progress, learn and connect, be passionate about advocacy, and inspire each other to further our work. Welcome to Out Summit 2022. If this is our first session that we're seeing you, welcome. If you're coming back after our opening, thank you for staying. My name is Louisa Viab. I'm the UN Senior Program Officer here at Outright International, and I am joined today by two amazing panelists so we can have a conversation about a seat at the table, civil society engagement with the United Nations. I'll start really quickly just introducing our panelists and then we can move forward. But before I do that, I just want everyone to know that we do have interpretation for Spanish in this session, and we also have captioning. So please, I'm not going to do the thing because I don't know where you have to click because I'm not seeing your cameras, but I do know that if you click on interpretation, you can also hear our session in Spanish. And thank you so much. I'm just going to start really quickly by introducing Tess. Tess McVoy leads ISHR work on LGBTI rights defenders, as well on legal protection and work. She's part of ISHR's legal team, which engages in strategic litigation for the protection of human rights defenders. She engages with UN mechanisms in New York, as well as in Geneva, with a specific focus in the rights of defenders working on issues of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Before joining ISHR, Tess worked with leading international law firm DLA Piper and with community legal centers working on women's and refugees' rights. Hi, Tess, welcome. And I want to introduce my second panelist, and Astrid, I'm really sorry that my accent in Danish is really bad, so I'm going to say it really badly. Astrid Wiborg Jensen, this policy advisor on human rights and the gender focal point at the Danish UN mission. Before joining the mission, she spent 5 years working in Action Aid on shrinking civic spaces, youth policies, and gender issues, especially focused on the African continent. Her areas of expertise are gender equality, civic space, and the promotion and protection of women's and girls' human rights. She holds a master's degree in global studies and international development from Roskilde University in Denmark. I also take this moment to apologize for one of the panelists that could not join us today due to personal issues, but I do know that we will have a very important conversation today, and we hope to have UNICEF in different conversations with us soon. So I just want to kickstart this conversation by talking on how important it is that we talk about having a seat at the table and the engagement with the United Nations. I know a lot of people think that this is a very far away work, that it's not connected to what they do, but it is so important and it's so great that we're here today to have this conversation. And I just want to kickstart a conversation maybe with you, Tess, that this year we had several wins at the United Nations. We had the renewal of the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity. We maintained some language in resolutions, and we also saw a lot of barriers for the engagement of civil society and actually participating in the UN spaces. Can you share us a little bit about the work that you've been doing and those experiences?
Sure. Thanks, Louisa. So the UN is vital for a civil society to confront power and oppression and to push for change. And this can especially be true for those of us working on LGBTI issues, where even our existence is challenged in certain national contexts. At the same time, for the UN to be relevant and to have genuine impact on the ground, engagement by civil society and affected communities is essential. The UN is dependent on information from civil society and from defenders. And despite our role being recognised in UN resolutions and by UN experts and bodies, some governments concerned about facing criticism try to lock civil society out of conversations, while others harass or discredit them. So while there are various UN bodies and mechanisms we could discuss when talking about civil society access, or as Louisa posed the question, barriers to civil society access, to ensure I don't take up too much time, I'm going to focus briefly on the UN Committee on NGOs, the third committee, and the issue of reprisals. So firstly, the Committee on NGOs, or the NGO Committee. Many have voiced concerns about the practice of the NGO Committee. It's mandated to accredit or to grant consultative status to NGOs. It's essentially the gatekeeper to NGO participation with the UN. Its mandate says that NGOs working with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be granted accreditation. However, some member states of the committee prioritize political and economic interests over a commitment to civil society. They do this by asking repetitive and politically motivated questions that ultimately defer an NGO application for consultative status for several years. We've also witnessed that NGOs working on human rights, as well as those working on specific issues such as sexual reproductive health and rights or LGBTI rights, are more likely to have their applications deferred. And given deferral can last for many years, it is ultimately a form of blocking NGO participation with the UN. Until last Wednesday, the application of the International Dalit Solidarity Network had been deferred for over 15 years, despite responding to committee's questions repeatedly, efficiently, and in good faith. So I've spoken a little bit about the process of granting accreditation to the UN. Once an NGO then has that accreditation, they gain additional rights to engage with UN processes, and that includes entering the UN building. I'll now speak briefly to the third committee of the General Assembly, which is in New York and deals with human rights, humanitarian affairs, and social matters. So despite processes of the third committee being quite similar to those of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is another body of the UN that sits in Geneva and is mandated to deal with human rights issues, civil society participation at the third committee in New York is much more restricted. We can't make statements in formal sessions at the third committee, and it's also the practice that NGOs can only attend informal negotiations of resolutions if invited by the state that is leading that negotiation. Alternatively, at the Human Rights Council, statements can be made in formal sessions and we can both attend and engage in informal negotiations. And I'm not saying that there aren't critical areas where NGO participation at the Human Rights Council can't be improved. In fact, the opposite. There are various calls from those engaging with the Council to do just that. And this is essentially the same at every UN body or mechanism. But I simply draw the comparison to highlight the extent of restrictions to civil society participation at the third committee. One example I think really clearly demonstrates the barriers we face in New York is regarding restrictions to the building during COVID. So civil society was the stakeholder that was locked out of UN headquarters for the longest time. Despite the UN saying that civil society is a key stakeholder of the UN, in fact, visitors were able to enter the building before civil society was once again allowed access to the building. The final obstacle I wanted to mention is reprisals and intimidation against those engaging or seeking to engage with the UN. Civil society bringing realities on the ground to the UN is precisely why some governments seek to systematically prevent them from engaging with the UN. Everyone has the right to communicate with the UN, and states have the responsibility and duty to protect that right. Despite this, every year there are various reports of people who engage with the UN, perhaps by sending a report to the UN, meeting with UN experts, or attending UN sessions, who suffer intimidation or reprisal simply for engaging or for seeking to engage with the UN. Forms of reprisals include arbitrary legal proceedings, organizations being unfairly scrutinized, being spied on or defamed, denied access to funding, arbitrary arrest, physical violence, and even disappearance or death. And these reprisals are often carried out by powerful state agents such as the police, security forces, or the judiciary, or non-state actors such as armed groups or businesses. The impact of these reprisals and intimidation is that civil society is silenced. They also act as a deterrent for civil society engagement. For those of us working on LGBTI issues, and especially those of us already acting in restrictive environments, this impact can be even stronger. So reprisals and intimidation are in fact human rights violations in and of themselves, but they also act to undermine the core functioning of the UN human rights system. How can the UN address issues on the ground if those telling the stories are then silenced? So I'll close by saying for the UN to be responsive and effective in preventing and addressing human rights violations, defenders and affected communities, LGBTI activists need to be able to engage. And how can the UN seek to address violations on the ground without input from the ground? So we're constantly fighting to both maintain access to these UN discussions and to maintain space that we have gained and fought for over time. And we hope that both the UN Secretariat and more states will do more to take genuine action to also protect that space at the UN.
Thank you so much, Tess. And you have not talked too much at all, and we want to listen a lot more of what you have to say because this is such an important issue. And I think you're absolutely correct that we do need to work with our allies, and we need to figure out a way that the UN really does represent we the peoples, and not only a couple of groups that manage to get visas, to get to travel, to get to go to different spaces. And following up a little bit on that, I want to call on Ashid because, you know, Denmark has been such a strong leader for pushing for participation of civil society in multilateral spaces. We saw the Unmute campaign this year, and we saw a push for actually having civil society in the group. And it saddened us very much every time that we remember that even visitors could enter the UN building before civil society, even though we do such an important work. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit why this is a priority for you and for the Danish mission, and why do you think also including LGBTIQ voices with all their particularities is so important for your work?
Thank you so much, Louisa, and just wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this very interesting panel. I'm noting down everything that is being said, so really appreciate it. And in that line, thank you so much, Tess, for your strong remarks. I couldn't agree more. So why is this important? Well, I could answer that question very briefly, actually. I promise I won't. But I could, because it's actually, for me, very simple and fundamental, namely, I mean, human rights and freedoms are for everyone. Equality is for everyone, no matter gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity. The freedom to choose one's partner and to openly express and live by one's sexual orientation and gender identity is fundamental. Hence, this has to be a priority. Now, let me elaborate. Fighting for human rights of LGBTI persons is a long-standing priority for Denmark. In fact, homosexuality was decriminalized in Denmark in 1933, and Denmark was the first nation in the world to recognize registered partnership for same-sex couples. And in 2017, Denmark was the first in the world to no longer define being transgender as a mental illness. This is, of course, important today because in too many places, and you know much more than I do about these things, LGBTI persons are still excluded, discriminated, robbed of their dignity, and sometimes even of their lives. And this exclusion and discrimination, of course, hinders LGBTI persons' access to full and equal and effective participation and decision-making in public life, and challenges the very notion that every individual is born free and equal with equal rights. Thus, these issues for Denmark is also very intertwined. And let me in that regard recall, and I think you already mentioned it, Louisa, the opening words of the UN Charter, which is exactly we the peoples, not we the states, but we the peoples. And this is also how Denmark approaches our work at the UN. We are fully aware that we need the inclusion, we need meaningful participation of all stakeholders to achieve our common goal of a sustainable and peaceful world. Also, let us not forget that the UN Secretary General, in his call to action for human rights, and later in his report, Our Common Agenda, has set a very clear direction, actually, stressing the importance of a human rights-based approach across pillars and calling for the protection and promotion of civic space. And this very fundamental notion is also the notion that is behind, and you mentioned it, Louisa, the Unmute initiative, which was correctly created back in 2020 as part of the Danish leadership on civic space, human rights, democracy, and gender equality. We made this initiative together with a group of a group of civil society organizations, and together with Costa Rica. And we have used this initiative to reiterate meaningful civil society inclusion as a essential prerequisite for sustainable development, safeguarding peace and security, and protecting human rights. So it's against this backdrop that Denmark and Costa Rica developed, together with this group of CSOs, a list of concrete recommendations on ways to enhance and ensure meaningful civil society participation at the UN. And these recommendations, they were endorsed by 52 member states and 264 civil society organizations, and they were presented for the consideration of the UN Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So basically, the Unmute initiative has provided Denmark with a normative amplifier, you could say, and a platform to hold member states and UN entities accountable to promote civil society inclusion, including human rights defenders, including LGBTI persons, across all three pillars in the UN. So basically, my hope is, of course, that maybe someday we will no longer have to fight to ensure civil society participation and for the rights of LGBTI persons, and these will, be accepted for across the globe for what they are, which is, of course, fundamental human rights. It sounds very simple, but Denmark's goal is actually that equal rights for all one day will actually mean equal rights for all. But until then, rest assured that ensuring meaningful civil society inclusion, including LGBTI voices, will continue to be a main priority to Denmark. And I will proudly repeat those words in the UN that I have just shared with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. And this is so important that we're here sitting with allies and having this conversation, and just remembering that we do have people and states and other stakeholders to go to when those things happen, and we have different difficulties throughout the space. I obviously, as a moderator, forgot to tell everyone something. We do have a Q&A box for you to put your questions to our amazing panelists so we can continue the conversation, and they're not just being scrutinized by me, but they also get the opportunity to talk about different topics that you're interested in listening about. And I want to move forward and thinking, what are the great wins? Because we talk about a lot of challenges and a lot of difficulties. What are the great wins that we saw on LGBTIQ issues in your work? And I also want to do a little follow-up saying what makes it difficult and what were the difficulties that you had to encounter along the way for those wins. And Astrid, why don't we go back to you this time?
Thank you very much, Louisa. So if I'll start with the wins, and then I'll be happy to go to the challenges, because there are plenty, unfortunately. So on a very national level, this year the Danish government finalized the second LGBTI action plan. And this action plan, we already had one, and this is the second one. And the focus areas for this action plan is on LGBTI families, LGBTI children, on youth and domestic violence, sexual assaults, and hate crimes against LGBTI persons. And one of the concrete areas, focus areas in the plan, is the right to legal gender reassignment, no matter your age. And this is a great win because it grants trans children the right to be recognized as the person they feel like. It is also a clear aim in the action plan that Denmark should continue to be in the forefront for protecting LGBTI persons' human rights globally. And in this line, a huge win for us, of course, was that we joined the LGBTI core group together with Honduras earlier this year. And this is important because this enables us to jointly work towards protection and ensuring the universal human rights of all LGBTI persons nationally and internationally, including at the United Nations. Looking at the current challenges, Denmark and I personally remain deeply concerned about the violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the ongoing neglect of LGBTI persons' basic rights to decide over their own body and life. We are seeing a very, very worrisome tendency that is not going in the right direction. As a co-leader of the Action Coalition on Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights and Bodily Autonomy, Denmark remains deeply concerned that access to basic sexual and reproductive health services for LGBTI persons continues to be denied. Denmark is constantly pushing to make UN documents and resolutions more ambitious, or maybe just ambitious, on the rights and protection of LGBTI persons, and to ensure that no one is left behind, regardless of who you are, who they love, or how they identify. Because there is a need to push, as I said before, we see how references to LGBTI persons or just mentioning diversity or intersectionality receives a massive and coordinated backlash, including in the UN. So even though we see strengthened language on LGBTI persons in UN resolutions, it is also very worrisome that the most ambitious text that we just adopted during this year's third committee, including the most ambitious references to LGBTI persons, were not agreed by consensus. Furthermore, to me, one of the main challenges is, and that speaks very much in continuation of the theme of this conversation today, is the lack of access. We all know that representation matters, and therefore it's of course a huge issue that we don't see more LGBTI activists in the UN. And I believe that all states, and that also goes to my own, could do more to enhance LGBTI persons in their delegations. And I promise you that Denmark will do what we can to walk the talk, but we'll also do what we can to encourage other member states to do the same, among others through the Unmute initiative. Thank you, Louisa.
No, thank you, Astrid, and it's great to hear concrete suggestions and ideas for the future for more inclusion. But Taz, I want to ask you the exact same question. We want to see what are the wins that we had this year, and what were the difficulties to get those wins?
Thanks, Louisa. So for this question, I think I'll respond on one key win we had this year at the UN, and this will ensure ongoing and sustained inclusion of LGBTIQ issues at the UN. I think it's kind of jumping off what was just said about kind of having more LGBTIQ people within the UN. This progress happened at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where a resolution was adopted this July, which renewed for the second time the mandate of the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity for more 3 years. But on this comment about having more LGBTIQ people in the room, we supported so many activists to come again to the council this year, and it's true. It's in those times when we're doing these big campaigns, there's so many of us in the room, and it's so different to the normal UN sessions where we don't see our queer communities that are in those spaces as much. But so the mandate of the independent expert was initially created in 2016, and it was renewed for the first time in 2019. And while it's been supported by a growing number of states from all regions, the process to renew the mandate again this year wasn't an easy one. And there was, again, fierce opposition from some states. It was an honor to once again co-coordinate a global coalition of organizations calling for the renewal of this mandate. We had 1,256 NGOs from 149 states and territories in all regions which supported this campaign. The vote renewing the mandate was also a win, as it was the first time that the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution that explicitly condemned legislation that criminalizes consensual same-sex conducts and diverse gender identities, and it called on states to amend discriminatory legislation and combat violence on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. The continued existence of a specific UN human rights mechanism on violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is crucial for our communities to be heard at the global level. The independent expert assesses the implementation of international human rights law. He talks to states, works collaboratively with other UN and regional mechanisms, simply to address violence and discrimination of these communities. Since its creation in 2016, the world has heard more about the impact of criminalization of same-sex relations between consenting adults, the need to legally recognize a person's gender, barriers to social inclusion, the importance of collecting data related to LGBT lives, and harm caused by so-called conversion therapy. The mandate since July can now continue to support initiatives in countries around the world, ensuring that LGBT and gender diverse people are free from inequality. The creation of the mandate in 2016 was the result of the commitment of some states and the loud and ongoing call from human rights defenders and civil society. The renewal of the mandate for the second time this year guarantees that these defenders and their communities will continue to have an impactful ally at the UN, who can echo their stories and support them in advocating for equality and for the safety of LGBT and gender diverse people everywhere. In today's context, when anti-rights and anti-gender movement is even stronger, the fact that this mandate is able to continue is critical. However, the fact that opposition was strong and that it required consistent and strategic engagement by states and civil society simply for the mandate to be extended, a mandate that again has existed for the past 6 years, also demonstrates where we currently sit. This was a huge win this year. And the fact that it was also not challenged at the third committee of the General Assembly, as it was in 2016, is also a win for LGBT communities globally. But we're continuing to fight to maintain existing protections while we're also seeking to extend protections for our communities.
Thank you, Taz, and thank you for leading this work as well. The work with the renewal of the Independent Soviet Coalition is a very hard work with so many participants from so many places. As Taz showed, there's impressive numbers, and it's something that continues being so important for our communities and so important for actual engagement and meaningful participation in the spaces, and having an independent expert that can actually give us some data and can actually talk to different stakeholders that we might not be able to is such a great win. And I'm also checking the Q&A, and one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A is a question that I already had thought about asking both of you, because we talked about a lot of the wins, a lot of the difficulties, and sometimes for those who are listening to us today, in this panel, it looks very far away. As I mentioned in the beginning, it looks like a different reality than the work that they're actually doing. And it doesn't seem like they can engage in the spaces. So the question I wanted to ask, and perhaps Tess, we can go back to you and then go to Astrid. Question I wanted to ask both of you is, what are some entry points that people can see that can actually engage to do this different work that you're doing when it comes to LGBTIQ rights issues at the United Nations, at the multilateral spaces? What are some key opportunities that you see for people to engage in this work?
Thanks, Louisa. So I'm going to talk to maybe 4 or 5 different areas which came to mind when I read this question. One of the areas that a number of organizations, and our organization outright, ILGA and RFSL, as well as COC and others, those organizations that are kind of more international and regional organizations working on this issue, we have been running trainings for activists to engage with UN mechanisms. So UN engagement should be an additional tool for to create national level change. We see it as kind of, if you're doing work at the national level, this is another tool that you can use, another mechanism that you can use to ultimately try and create change at the national level. And many organizations, including ours, run annual trainings. They're tailored to support activists to learn how to engage with UN mechanisms, and also to do so in a way that is kind of seen as can be more effective on the ground. So I would encourage you to look out for those opportunities. We also have an online training. It's called the ISHR Academy, that is also open to anyone. So keeping an ear to kind of the ground and different movements on opportunities, and also looking for online opportunities as well. The other point is kind of engaging with mechanisms. So you don't need to have UN accreditation to engage with the UN. There are other ways that you can engage without that accreditation. If your NGO receives accreditation, obviously you have enhanced participation rights, but without that accreditation, you can still submit reports on the situation of your communities or the national context, both to treaty bodies and to the Universal Periodic Review of your country. You also can engage with different special procedure mandate holders. So special procedures are like the UN experts that we talked about before. The independent expert on violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is one of those mandates. So they conduct country visits where you can meet with them. They also do calls for inputs into report, which you can also input into. So there's opportunities to send in information that then gets articulated in different UN recommendations and reports. The other thing I would say is engage in global movements. So for example, like the campaign to renew the independent expert, if that's something that you see as impactful and useful to your work, engaging in those coalitions can also provide you with, assisted advocacy to UN spaces, and also create more networks and communities among the global coalition that does engage currently with the UN. The other thing is to publicize recommendations and statements coming out of the UN. So this is another place where civil society is really, really important. The UN are going to publicize and make recommendations. UN bodies, human rights experts from the UN will make recommendations, whether it be on our communities, on specific communities within the LGBTIQ population, or on a national context. Once those reports come out, it's really good for civil society to then publicize them more, to really to highlight what has been said by these UN bodies, and to also use those reports to hold our governments accountable to either the recommendations or reports that have been made, or in certain circumstances, our states, our governments would have made commitments in those spaces, and we can use the reports coming out of the UN to hold them accountable to the commitments they're making at the international level, so that there is that strengthened connection. And then finally, just to kind of strengthen relations and networks with organizations that work at the UN, both my organization and Outright and various others, one of the key roles that we, or objectives, aims that we hope to achieve is to enhance access to UN spaces and to support activists to engage with the UN. So reach out to us, have conversations with us, so we can talk about, the brilliant things about the UN and also the challenges and the complexities that are involved. But again, have those conversations and think about other opportunities that may exist for you.
Thank you, Taz. And before I pass it to Astrid, I have a very specific follow-up question to you, Taz, that was put in the chat. If you can repeat the name of the online training.
Sure. It's called my organization is the International Service for Human Rights, so ISHR, and it's called the ISHR Academy. But I can put a link in the chat for anyone interested in seeing that. And we've also just released a call for applicants for our annual training that will be in person, that happens around the Human Rights Council. So I can also add that to the chat as well.
Yes, please do, Tess. And I'll also, after Astrid, will take the chance to talk a little bit about the opportunity that Outright sees too. But Astrid, please, why don't you talk to us a little bit about what entry points you see from your end?
Thank you very much, Luisa, and thank you also to you, Tess, for providing these very good suggestions for entry points. So I think, first of all, I think it speaks very much, this question, to my point on the LGBTI core group and Denmark joining that, because what we see here is that cross-regional advocacy is key. This agenda is only moving forward if the push comes from a cross-regional group. We must simply insist that the fight for LGBTIQ persons' human rights is not a Western agenda, because it is obviously not. This is about upholding a fundamental human right. So in that regard, I also encourage everyone to share and to collect data. We all know that knowledge is power, because facts are simply not a point of view. So this also makes it easier for us as member states in our discussions and in our negotiations, because it simply makes our arguments stronger. In that regard, it's very key to inform, and I'm of course focusing on how you can also influence member states to inform, and that speaks also to the data point. What is behind the references that some member states are very afraid of? I think a good example is the reference to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, which has been a very contested reference, because some member states believe that this speaks to LGBTIQ persons' rights. And of course it also does, but the way we have kind of push this forward, it is also to basically explain what intersectionality means. What is it that it also speaks to how you can be living in a rural area, you can be a person with a disability. So it basically just speaks to there are many things at stake that enhances or makes the discrimination stronger. So kind of making those, it seems very simple, but I mean, making those explanations to member states, which makes them it makes them it makes it easier for them to argue to their capital and say, this is not dangerous for us, or this is not something that we can't push for. And of course, you have to be selective with which arguments that you present to which member state. But this comes back very much to the importance of civil society inclusion, because we do exactly come to the table with different ideas, different competencies, and possibilities for action. And while we, of course, have to answer to different constituencies, we have the shared goal of ensuring peace and sustainable development. Because there's no doubt that through your lived experience, diverse range of expertise, and feet on the ground, not the least, you enrich and improve the relevance and outcomes of our work. And time has shown this again and again. In that regard, I invite all also to reach out to the Danish embassies in your country, who can inform you how to engage and also how Denmark works with LGBTI persons in your specific context. And as for the work here in the UN, I personally encourage everyone to reach out if there's something we can do differently, do more of, do better. And also let me know about your ideas and initiatives. This is really what makes it easier for us to bring these things forward. In that regard, I can inform that in relation to the Unmute initiative, we are planning to make what we call an Unmute manual, because as I informed before, we have these concrete recommendations on how to enhance meaningful civil society inclusion in the UN. So the idea is to have a manual that is actually speaks to, so how do we then do it? What is needed? What do we do? How do we do it? Because our experience is that actually there is an appetite for many member states, but they don't, they need to know how this should be done. And therefore we are kind of drafting this manual, and we will have an open hearing where all civil society organizations are kind of brought in to give their inputs on how this should be done, because of course this is not something we can do and make without you. So I can only underscore nothing about you without you, and we must of course continue to stand strong in our fight for human rights, leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you both, and I'm going to take the opportunity and my moderator privileges to also share one big opportunity that we have on Outright's end. We currently have opened a call for participants for our called United Nations Rights and Religion Fellowship. I see that Hannah just put it in the chat. And this is a great opportunity because it's something we've been doing for the past 4 years, 5 years now, which we train activists who are doing the work on the ground, combating religiously based LGBTIQ phobia, combating the so-called anti-gender movement that is combating the so-called gender ideology, which doesn't really exist. And as Tess mentioned in the beginning, this is an opportunity for those who are already doing the work on the ground to learn how to use the tool that the UN is. And as we've seen in this conversation today, we see that there are a lot of difficulties and there are a lot of nuances to UN work. And the more we get people on the ground learning how to do this tool, and the more we occupy the spaces, the better it is. Hannah has put all the information on the chat. We're very excited that post the start of COVID-19 pandemic, this will be our first in-person cohort. So we'll be bringing people for the Commission on the Status of Women, the High Level Political Forum, for the United Nations General Assembly. And this is a great opportunity for those of you who are sitting here today listening about the UN and thinking, how can you engage more? This is a very specific opportunity that Outright brings along, but obviously we have more opportunities from partners and from different organizations that we're more than happy to share with everyone as well. And after taking this little detour to talk about something myself, my opportunity, I want to just get some questions from the people that are listening to us today. And one of the questions that I saw that I think is really important that we do talk about is, one, how does this affect specifically trans and non-binary human rights defenders who want to come at the UN? And how do you find particularly difficulties and solutions when it comes to that? Does anyone want to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in. I think that, all of the challenges, all of the barriers we spoke about before, they exist for everyone. And so we have this starting with the accreditation processes. There's a restriction on access to the UN. And then once accreditation is granted, there's a restriction in kind of modalities for participation. But as I mentioned when I was talking about the NGO committee, we do see that organizations focusing on specific issues are those that are more likely to be deferred in those processes. And queer, trans, intersex rights organizations and kind of broader LGBTIQ organizations are organizations that are often more likely to be blocked at that initial stage. The membership of the NGO committee, it's a 19-member committee, and the majority of the members who are states of that committee are both not progressive and supportive of civil society. They're also not progressive and supportive of LGBTQI issues either. And so there's already challenges at that initial stage. If I think a little bit about the Human Rights Council, we've definitely seen progress since 2011. So 2011 was the first time there was ever a resolution which was passed, which had the words sexual orientation and gender identity in it. So this has been long standing, the work we've been doing at the UN to progress these rights. Prior to that, you couldn't even say those words at the UN. Sexual orientation, gender identity were words that couldn't be spoken. Now they're words that often come into resolutions, that have come into resolutions since then. We now, since 2016, have a mandate. The mandate of the independent expert has also done a lot of work to bring in issues on gender identity and issues faced by trans folks and trans communities. So there has been a lot of progress being made. And I think one of the things that is really useful is to try and build on that progress and to also support activists. I think if we're finding still that civil society of these communities are not getting initial access, there's an obligation on our organizations that have accreditation, not just those of us also that work on these issues, those that work on broader human rights issues, to bring in intersex and trans folks to the UN, bring in issues, speak to those issues. We often are talking about now intersectionality, but actually ensuring there is genuine intersectionality across movements, within movements, and bringing these voices to the UN. The last year, I think, and the year before, there was a resolution at the Human Rights Council on intersex rights. So there's also has been progress made there as well to before. But again, this progress is slow, and so access and kind of support and collaboration and solidarity is all needed to ensure that that's possible.
Astrid, I see that we have a specific question for you on our Q&A that in terms of wins, when we strengthen the language in UN documents, how does that impact the work outside of the UN? And then I have a question that's the other way around, that is, how does the work from those on the ground, especially LGBTIQ people, impact those wins in the UN itself?
That's a really good question. Thank you very much. And it's honestly also when we sit down in the dungeons of the UN and negotiate these things in length, I sometimes ask the same question. I mean, does this really make the change? But of course, this is what we can work with here in the UN. These are the resolutions. Of course, it makes a lot of sense. But let me start with the last part of the question, which was how can these texts be influenced, if I understood it correctly, Louisa, by inputs from the LGBTIQ community. So, as I said before, getting inputs from your community, having concrete suggestions for language, having data is so key. I can't underscore it enough. Is what we use when we have the negotiations, basically. This is what we use when we sit and negotiate. So, Denmark is part of the EU, when we agree on a position in the EU, or when we sit in the larger negotiation room. It's also what we use when we have all our bilateral meetings with member states. Not all the negotiations takes place in that big room. There are so many conversations and discussions going on outside bilaterally. And this is exactly where we influence the most. This is where we speak with other member states and we convince them or inform them, why is this important? And what we use is the arguments that we get from the data and from the experiences from you. So that's why it's so important, and we are 100% dependent on it. That's how we can make the change. And that's why I can't stress enough how important these inputs are. And I mean, you can send it directly to my email to the Danish mission. You can also send it to the EU delegation. I think it's maybe that speaks also to the question before, how it's important to push cross-regionally, because the more who kind of push for these things, the more it looks bad for those who don't. And I can tell you one thing, well, at least that is for most of the member states in the UN, you don't want to be singled out. You don't want to stand as the only one promoting an idea. That's in general the sentiment. So how does it work the other way around? I mean, I think that's actually something that, again, I would like to hear from you, how you experienced it. But I would say from my end, my understanding is that, of course, it's important that we as an international community agree on some language that acknowledge the existence of so many people, and also granting or underscoring that this is about human rights. This is not, again, as I said before, this is not a Western agenda. So of course it's important that we send a signal as the United Nations saying, of course, we see you, we hear you, we acknowledge you. So I think that, of course, I mean, that would be my thinking, but happy to hear other thoughts. But I believe that this is important. Many of the texts that we agree on the resolutions, they are not operational, meaning it's not that when we agree to a text in the UN that we then have to live up to a certain standard nationally. So there are no like legal implications for most of the text that we agree to. So in that sense, you can say it's very symbolic, or it's very, no, I would actually say that would be undermining, but it sends a signal. But of course, it's also used to holding states accountable. I mean, if you agree to something in the UN, that makes it difficult, or even more difficult, to then, push back on some basic rights, because then other member states in the UN would say, well, we agreed to this, and you actually, this is agreed by consensus, or you voted for this, and therefore, this is a double standard, or you have to live up to these things. So it's also a tool for us as member states to hold each other accountable. And it's also a tool for you, I would say, a civil society to hold us accountable, to remind what was agreed and what has been actually written down and adopted here in the UN.
Thank you so much, Astrid. And I see that we have a lot of questions, but I want to give time for my panelists to also give their final remarks. So I just want to go on one question and test for you specifically, because I see a couple of questions on reprisals. If you could just address that a little bit, because I think it's so important that we do talk about it on reprisals and what has been done about that specifically.
Sure. Can I also quickly add a response to the previous question?
Please do.
I think it kind of links up to some of the other questions in the space as well. This idea of, how can we continue to impact and change even if we're not accredited? One of the things that we've been trying to call on states in relation to negotiations at the UN, and to build on what Astrid was saying about getting guidance from civil society, is that asking states who are leading on these negotiations to have consultations with civil society, but beyond us, beyond those of us that are constantly in the room. And so at the last session where the resolution on human rights defenders was negotiated, we brought together civil society at the national level, regional level, international level, to have a meeting with Norway that was leading on that resolution. And so really trying to widen out those of us, the civil society that is being consulted, to ensure that the voices from the ground are being brought into those conversations. That's also a role of our organizations, but really making those connections, I think, is really integral. Okay, on reprisals. So reprisals is one of those issues that our organization has been lobbying on for many, many years. Over the past many years, there have been some developments at the UN that have been wins, but there remains a lot more that can be done. So there is the Assistant Secretary General now has a mandate, which is called the Senior Official on Reprisals. And that role is to kind of address reprisals kind of across the UN broadly. And as part of that role, the Secretary General every year produces a report that collates reported cases of reprisals that take place. So kind of names the cases and shares that, and it's presented at the UN for discussion. Beyond that, any case of reprisal that takes place can be separately informed to the Assistant Secretary General in their position as a senior official of reprisals for them to take action. So they will bilaterally speak with the relevant state concerned, bilaterally speak with the activist who had suffered the reprisal, sometimes in some cases speak out publicly. We're trying to encourage that process more. Beyond that, most of the main UN human rights mechanisms, the special procedures, the treaty bodies, the Human Rights Council and the UPR have over time developed specific procedures to respond to cases of reprisals. So there is a rapporteur on reprisals within the Coordinating Committee of Special Procedures, where cases can be brought to if a reprisal takes place in relation to engagement with special procedures. And in treaty bodies, they've developed the San Jose Guidelines, which also set out a process if a reprisal has taken place. One of the things we've been really calling for a lot lately is for states to specifically call out cases of reprisals in UN conversations and at the Human Rights Council. So there have been some states that have been willing to not only just say reprisals are bad and call out the issue of reprisals, but also highlight specific cases and naming the victims of the reprisal. And we've seen that that's really, really important to create some accountability for the states that were involved in the conduct of the reprisal. We have a handbook on reprisals, which sets out all these mechanisms, which I can also share in the text. And we've also developed recently a database where we've collated all of the reported cases of reprisals that have happened and kind of action that's been taken on them. I'll end by saying, this database and the reported cases are just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more cases. And as I said, reprisals deter engagement. So there's also cases that are never probably going to be reported because the impact of them was that people have been silenced. So it's a huge issue. It's an ongoing issue. And as I said, one that we're constantly advocating for more action from the UN, because if people can't communicate to the UN, then the UN ultimately is not going to hear those perspectives and be able to create change on the ground.
Thank you so much, Tess. And I see that we're about to end our session. So I want to give time for both of you to give them final remarks. And considering that we had so many questions and such many interesting issues, including data collection and the geopolitics of the UN, and considering how to participate long distance, I know we could continue having this conversation for several hours, which I love because usually that's not the response I get when I say we're going to talk about the UN. So this brings me a lot of joy, but I want to give you both a minute or two just to give closing remarks. What is the main message you want to tell everyone that's listening to us today? How to contact you, how to figure out different things, and just start by saying thank you both so much because I continue to learn every time I hear all of you. Astrid, why don't you give us your final remarks?
Thank you so much, Louisa, and thank you everyone who have participated. I can only echo what you just said, Louisa. I continue to learn every time we have these discussions, and that just underscore how important it is, and therefore thanking you once again for inviting me. And that, of course, speaks in continuation of what I have tried to send the message, which is, of course, nothing about you without you. And I really want to emphasize and underscore that it is key, and it is a key priority to Denmark that we push for civil society inclusion, including LGBTIQ persons. And this is something that I intend to live up to. So therefore, hold me accountable as well, and remind us what we can do, and also remind us when we are not doing the best. So because that is really only the way we can improve. And then just really hoping and encouraging everyone again to push not only to the countries that are with you, but also the ones who are a bit more difficult. And I'll be happy to have discussions with you, because that will help us, of course, in our work. So basically, I really hope that it was, I have provided some concrete examples on how we work on this, but happy to engage, and feel free to reach out. And I know the same goes for, as I also mentioned, the embassies around in the world, because I imagine we have a cross-regional participation today. And I know, as you were saying, Louisa, the UN is not always the most, what can we say? It's a big machinery, right? So it's also, and there's of course a lot of things going on around the world, not only in the UN. So also just underscoring and encouraging everyone to reach out to the Danish embassies in the world, around the world. But thank you so much again.
No, thank you, Astrid. And Tess, your final remarks.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll be super brief. I kind of wanted just to echo this idea of allied, like creating allies across regionally and also across different forms of stakeholders, working with states, like Denmark and other states cross-regionally to ensure access is strengthened. We can from now on only go up in terms of civil society participation. We've already seen the progress we've made since 2011, as I was saying, on issues of sexual orientation and gender identity, and we'll continue to make that progress, including with independent expert. At the same time, we're in a moment where we need to keep fighting, where our communities are constantly attacked, where the anti-gender, anti-rights movement is growing in how loud it is and how damaging I think it can be. And so to continue to work with solidarity and to support each other, and my organization remains here to support in any way that we can, and to continue to make progress at the UN and make sure that it is relevant and useful and for our communities on the ground.
Thank you so much, Tess. Thank you so much, Astrid. Thank you all of you who sent questions and have been here engaging from the beginning. We look forward to seeing you in different panels during our Out Summit in the following days and today. And I can't thank you all enough. This is such an important conversation, and we want to make the UN accessible for everyone. And when we say everyone, everyone. And we can continue having these different conversations, figuring out ways of working together. I hope the resources we shared in the chat are also very useful to all of you. But I just want to end saying thank you so much to my stellar panelists, because I continue to learn every time, and it's such a pleasure to listen to both of you. And thank you, everyone, and see you around in the next sessions of Out Summit.